this is very interesting as you got me on this track of thinking as I'm speaking. That idea is, for Plato, the reality.
Sure.
You see that?
Right.
Okay. And then any concretization of the idea, any matter in which that idea is seen by Plato is understood to be a kind of reflection, a participation by matter in that eternal idea or form. Okay? All right. When you get to Descartes, Descartes uses the word idea. That is, he uses, the French, or what we would say the English equivalent of Plato's notion, except that for Descartes, the idea is now not an eternally existing form in the Platonic sense. It is a representation in the mind, or at least this is the problem for him. It's putatively a representation to the mind of a reality, right? Which reality is the cause of it. So the reality causes the mind to have an idea of itself, literally, to have. So in Thomistic language, a likeness of itself. So now refresh me on exactly how you phrased your question, because I want to make sure I answer it directly.
Well, then, so I was wondering if now we're at a place where the thinking now occurring is a productive receptivity.
Right.
I'm wondering now because I see the relationship between the similitudo and the idea of it impinging somehow upon consciousness.
Right.
And the likeness occurs.
The cause of it being the cause of the likeness that consciousness has is
right.
the object.
Is something that's separate from itself.
In Aquinas.
That's right.
Right.
In Aquinas, and as it turns out in Descartes, although he has a doubt about it to begin with. He doubts it,
right.
But he ultimately concludes, ironically, thanks to the idea of God,
right.
which he cannot doubt the cause of, because it isn't himself.
Right. So by analogy, I'm trying to understand then where we are in relation to, because I see the the development of, I can see how self-consciousness developed historically.
Right.
And my original question was, if we're now in a place where we're going to call consciousness relationship to reality a productive receptivity, then what would you call conscious relationship to reality as a similitude or as an idea in Descartes? What would you call it? I mean, if just as
what would I call the
analogy.
relationship?
Yeah.
Construction.
Okay.
The consciousness is the construction of reality.
Right.
Substitute. Consciousness, in your language, is a relationship. Mm-hmm. It's a reality relationship. What is the relationship? It's construction. Mm-hmm. But it's pure or absolute construction. Mm-hmm. Or in the language of receptivity, it's a absolute receptivity.
Right. And in the world of Aquinas and Descartes,
right,
then the relationship wasn't constructive. It was.
Well, that's interesting. I would say in the sense in which I understand it in the thinking now occurring, it was not constructive, although it was, you might say it was implicitly so, or in some sense so, but it was not constructive in the sense that the idea, the similitude, the intelligible species, the ultimate cause of it was outside of consciousness.
Right.
So there was... go back to the original phrase, which I just blocked out of my mind a moment. Productive receptivity. Okay. So, in other words, in the Thomistic notion, consciousness is receptive of a reality, right. but to the extent to where it is receptive, it is not productive.
Okay. Right.
Okay, and where it is productive of its own knowledge, mm-hmm. it leaves off, so to speak, being receptive. Mm-hmm. So there's a continuing difference between the receptivity and the productiveness of consciousness.
Okay.
Now, in Kant, we're getting closer already to, because he lets go of the noumena. He lets go of what certainly in a Cartesian world would be the substantial cause of the in the Cartesian world, the substantial cause of the ideas that consciousness finds that it has. Kant gets rid of the substantiality of that cause, right? He radically creates a dualism in which he just brackets altogether in a kind of pre-phenomenological move. It's a phenomenology of a very literal sort. He brackets the substantiality of things, and then we have now a consciousness which is constructive. I would say, in the sense in which I'm using the term, no longer receptive, right? Because we bracketed the reception. We bracketed the question of reception, right? Because all we need to do is to understand, in the language that I was quoting last time, as Kant says, that consciousness, or as he puts it, the understanding is the author of its own experience.
Isn't there actually a receptivity to the noumena? It's just that the noumena can't be known. There's still a relation there.
A relation of what?
In Kant, well, it isn't that the things in themselves are denied. It's that we can't know them, so that what we actually know is our construction. But there still is some kind of. It isn't that we're generating phantasms spontaneously without any relationship to an unknowable exteriority.
Right, but I think in the language that Todd has introduced, I don't think Kant would be understood to be talking about a consciousness of the noumena.
No, but
of the noumenon, right? He would not.
It's still not. It's not a solipsism. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not even a pure Berkeleyan idealism, where the external world is generated utterly from within.
Correct.
Okay, so it seems to me that there is some aspect of receptivity. It's very difficult to say where it is, but if you deny it, then it becomes Berkeley.
Well, it doesn't become Berkeley either, because what Berkeley substitutes, actually Berkeley uses in a very original way. He makes use of the idea of God in a way which should remind us of Descartes, because God gives human consciousness these sensible impressions.
Right, but they're not coming from outside. They're still.
There's still a receptivity, though. In other words, they're coming from God. It's not. Again, it's not solipsism.
Okay, all right. So
you see what I'm saying?
So it's an internal receptivity.
Okay, right. And what I'm saying.
Well, you say there was no receptivity.
I'm saying that there's no. In your language, there's no internal receptivity of the noumenon, of the substance. He allows that the substance is there.
That's right.
Right.
But there's still a receptivity. When I see an object,
right,
the form of that object is utterly determined by the a priori structure of consciousness.
Right.
And yet, the specific instance that occurs to me as I'm creating as my faculty for creating, imagining the world is going on. It's going on in relationship to something that is not being. It's not utterly a projection. There is some kind of.
I guess I want to say I'm looking for the right word here. The noumenal world is allowed to be there precisely to the extent to which it's irrelevant to the scientific project. And the scientific project is the project of knowing.
Yes.
And to go back to the quotation, Kant says the understanding is the author of its own experience. And its experience is the limit within which the scientific enterprise takes place. I have no knowledge of the noumenon.
Yes.
In that sense, I do not. I think you could say if Kant cannot prove the existence or the non-existence of God, God is the chief noumenon, if I can put it that way. He is the idea of all ideas of reason. Right? So there's no way that I can prove or disprove the noumenal reality. So I guess what I'm trying to say, this goes back to my take on Aristotle, that Aristotle's Aristotle's ambition, like Kant's. Kant, in this sense, is Aristotelian, although compared to Hegel, he's a kind of a Platonist. But Aristotle's claims, as I think I pointed out in the Metaphysics, about the existence of God, the unmoved mover, is a very limited claim. It's the claim that the notion of the unmoved mover explains his problem of the ultimate cause of motion, right? And it's not an internally inconsistent explanation. That's all. That's all he says. Right? I mean, that's a very. So I think I used the word which you objected to at the time, that it's a hypothesis in this, but it's a hypothesis in a foundational sense. It's something that he understands to be true because it. If we use modern terms, saves the appearances in some sense.
That's
right?
a good Greek phrase for that time.
Okay.
Okay, I don't have a big brief with this. I just am not quite understanding it, but that's okay.
Well, I don't want to. I don't want to get bogged down in either. But
I agree.
However, so in terms of Todd's question, the way I'm answering him and what I intend, which I don't know if we can relate it, is that to the extent to which there is a constructive activity going on in Kant, it is not substantial. It doesn't go to the substance of things, right? Of which I can have no knowledge, all right? And he doesn't deny that there is a substance of things. That's right. Yes. But the human mind does not construct the substance of things. It constructs its own experience of the things.
Yes.
It constructs its own experience. It does the construction altogether. It's not receiving in that sense. It's not. See, for Descartes, God's reality causes the idea of God in human consciousness, and finally, although he starts by doubting it, finally, by the time you get to the sixth meditation, he understands that because God is a truthful being, infinitely truthful, not going to deceive him in such a radical way, he then concludes that the ideas that he has of the sensible world do, in fact, have substantial causes in things outside of his mind. Do you see what I'm saying? What Kant has done is he's restricted the realm of causality to the realm of natural experience. In other words, he denies, that's the whole point. He denies precisely that the noumenon can cause, right? Yeah. Because if that were true, then I would have an idea of the noumena. I have no idea of the noumena. I have no idea.
So in other words, he takes Descartes' conclusion and says, not justified. Leave it there.
Altogether. In other words, what he says is that if you're going to talk about causality, you have no basis. If you have no basis for Kant of talking about causality in anything outside of, or as emanating from anything outside of the realm of experience. So there is a system. There's a kind of a closed circle of natural causality, and so it appears in the. It appears in the four major categories which we talked about when we were doing Novitas Mundi. Yeah. It appears under the category, the fundamental. Remember, it's quantity, quality, relation, and modality. And causality is.
Well, there's another set of four. There's the time, space, logic, and causality are the other four categories.
I don't think they're called categories.
Okay, it's been too long.
All right. Okay.
There's that group of four that operate a priori in terms of the condition of consciousness, whatever their designation.
Right, but they're not the four. They're not the categories in the Aristotelian sense. In other words, Kant is organizing the categories that go back to Aristotle in a somewhat haphazard way, not quite totally haphazard, by the way, but more or less haphazard. He's organizing in a very specific set of 12 categories that are reducible to four major categories. Yes. The only point I want to make here is that causality for Kant is reduced. It comes under the category of under the category of relation. All right, so it's again a subordinate category in a way which would not be true for Descartes.
Where does receptivity come in TNO? In the sense one can see the productivity clearly.
Right.
So the question is what is one being receptive to, since the schema that one is generating is substance itself?
Well, I think there are two levels of that. I understand the receptivity having to do with something I was alluding to and trying to explain it last time. The notion that the thoroughgoing. I was starting with Hegel as someone who has a notion of a kind of thoroughgoing creation by an absolute consciousness of everything, going through, penetrating, as Waltraud said, thoroughly penetrating through, in this context, to the substance of things, right? Unlike Kant, right? So there is that. So there's an analogy there to begin with. So to distinguish the TNO from the Hegelian absolute self-consciousness, you see, I say this is an absolute other consciousness, which has a couple of corollaries. One is that that which is in a thoroughgoing and complete way constructed by an absolute other consciousness is itself other. In other words, it is not something that is internal to this consciousness. And the receptivity at that point would come in, I think, in two senses. The primary one of which I think I mentioned last time would be connected with the notion in the thinking now occurring, which comes up explicitly in the chapter on the creating the absolute edge, the notion that the creation understood now more clearly and directly, the notion that God creates the creature and the human soul in particular, to go back to Augustine, in his own image, right? That and this brings in the question of the transformation of the image into the reality, right? To be created in the image of God now is to be absolutely or completely independent of or other to God. I think other to is a little bit better than other than, because of the self-other connotations perhaps of other, right? Differentiated in independent existence from God. In other words, God's achievement in creating ex nihilo can now clearly be understood to be the creation of a creature that is not, as it were, continuing to hang upon the act of creation. In other words, God did it. I mean, he succeeded in absolutely creating a world, right? Which is not either in a traditional sense, I would say, an extension of his being, right? Nor in a Hegelian sense, an absolute intention of his being, in the sense of being simply a moment in the process of self-realization. Now that we're on to this, let me just say, it's nice how things work. I'm reading. I tell you, I keep rereading the journals of Kierkegaard, which are long enough to make it tolerable to keep doing that, because you forget what you read. You know, it's big. I came across this passage, and it was very interesting to me. In fact, I really should have brought it in. Maybe I will at some point, but I didn't want to take up too much time. But now we're on it. There's a page-long passage in the journal where Kierkegaard talks about this precise point that I'm making. This is in 1840. In his journals, I don't recall him ever doing this in one of his texts, but in the journal he's going on about, I forget what category it's under in the journal. It might be existence or God or something like that. And he's making the point that I've just made, in effect, although I'm going to show you the difference. And I'm reading this thing, right? And he's saying, in effect, broadly speaking, what Leahy just said, right? That the creator, when the creator creates, he really, if he's going to really do a good job, he has to make an independent creation, right? That's what he said. I'm not doing justice to the subtlety of his expression. So I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, now wait a minute. Kierkegaard is very close to the thinking now occurring. The thinking now occurring is very close to Kierkegaard. So I'm reading it, and as far as that goes, that statement I just made, that's right. That Kierkegaard should have thought such a thing fits my understanding of how close Kierkegaard would be to the thinking now occurring if he wasn't wrapped up in his modern subjectivity? So I read the damn thing over again to find out what's the difference between what I just said to you and what Kierkegaard says in a page. And son of a gun, when you read the passage carefully, what he says is that, and he's talking about omnipotence, the omnipotent, and he's right on, it's exactly the point. An omnipotent creator ain't omnipotent unless he can create something that stands on its own. You understand? Otherwise he's not omnipotent. All right, that's Kierkegaard, great. But, says Kierkegaard, he's continually doing this. Omnipotence is continually withdrawing from the creation. In other words, you get it? See, that's the subjective element, right? He's got the basic core notion, right, that an omnipotent creator creates something that stands independently of the creator. Otherwise, that isn't an omnipotent act of creation. But because of his radical subjectivity, because he's an inside-out, upside-down anti-Hegelian, you see, he has to understand this as an ongoing process of the withdrawal of the creator from the creation. It's right there. In fact,
so it's simultaneously continuous creation and continuous withdrawal from
creation? When you put it that way, it's interesting because it reminded me when I was reading it of Descartes. Mm-hmm. Because Descartes makes the point in the Meditations that creation, he understands himself to be created in two distinguishable ways, senses. One is that he was created, he was brought into being, right? He had a beginning of existence, unlike the creator. And he is continually created anew in every moment. That's the right?
Yeah.
So Kierkegaard is in that big ballpark of the
continuous creation.
But I'm trying to say is what the context for the continuity idea is the notion of subjectivity, right? And so he takes what would be the continuity that appears in Descartes, and I think again in an absolute way in Hegel, and if he wasn't, my sense of Kierkegaard is that he was just completely a man of his time, which I think is true of all of them, right? But I mean, in other words, he's got the instinct, but he doesn't have the intellectual understanding. In other words, so he's got the notion of omnipotence as a complete freestanding creation, omnipotent creator, a complete freestanding. But because of the subjective element, that takes the form of some kind of ongoing, continual. What? I'm looking for a word. A continual letting go.
Sounds like purse. In a certain way. Never getting to the end.
All right. In that sense, the continuity part is Peirce. However, Peirce is more like Hegel than he is like Kierkegaard, because for Peirce, not in a developmental way as it would be the case in Hegel, but in an evolutionary way. Nevertheless, Peirce at some level understands the creation to be the realization, not in the absolute and perfect way in which it is in Hegel. Peirce nevertheless understands the creation to be the realization of the creator. In other words, that end which we never finally arrive at, right? Would be for Peirce simultaneously the absolute self-revelation of the creator in the form. It's a good thing to bring up because it resonates with what we see in Altizer. The paradox being, if you want, or the thing that trips you up, is that we've said all along that ultimate realization of which we never actually arrive at, I said would be what? Absolute particularity, absolute specificity. Do you see? And in the context of a Hegelian synthesis, you would say, well, then that's absolute otherness. Do you see? And what I'm saying to you in response to in the way in which Peirce is not a Kierkegaardian, right? And Kierkegaard is a Kierkegaard. At the point at which Kierkegaard is the true Kierkegaard, he can't think. You see? Yeah. That's his problem. Kierkegaard he's got an understanding of some sort, but it's an understanding for which he can find no rational ground, right? So the point, all right, and where he has something like a rational ground, it comes out in the form of continuity. That takes us over to Peirce. But the thing in Peirce is that that ultimate, fully, I said self-realization of the Creator, is, if we ever arrived at it, would be an other, in my language, an absolute particularity or an absolute otherness. Now think of what Altizer says, you see, taking that and getting rid of all of the scaffolding. Altizer wants me to understand that the death of God is God's becoming his own otherness. Do you see? There's a deep consistency there. So the uniquely Kierkegaardian aspect, in other words, the originality, if I can put it that way, of Kierkegaard, which is an originality in the face of thought, the originality of one whose only relationship to thought ultimately is an absurdity. The originality of his understanding of faith, if I can put it that way, is the omnipotent the disconnect of the Creator and the creation. Do you say? But he compromises it with the notion of the continual disconnect. And so the thinking now occurring, just to finish this off, would be the notion that once and for all, no continuity. That part of it, and that when I say once and for all, then there's a certain resonance with the death of God theology. You see what I'm saying? Not in the sense in which Altizer intends it, but nevertheless there is that, right? That one of the easy things about Altizer's death of God theology is that God died. Okay, and the TNO answer to that is, well, not exactly the way you mean it, but yes, the creation is, as it were, a finality. Right? There's a finality about the omnipotent creation, and if anything, I think the critique of Altizer's death of God theology is that because of this absolute self-realization in its own otherness, is that just when I think I've got it, I've closed that circle again, right? That continuity is reasserting itself there. Okay.
But still, you didn't answer the question.
Which one?
The question about where receptivity is. I mean, receptivity feels like a distance.
Okay. You're right. I didn't.
What? Yeah.
I got off on the similitude. The image, the receptivity is the reception of this. One level of the receptivity is the reception of this constructive activity. In other words, the receptivity is that we have received this as creatures from this omnipotent Creator. In other words, so that the image is that the human consciousness is in its very structure, if I can put it that way, what it is, qua having received this ability. There's a phrase in today's assignment which I had kind of forgotten, which is right on this very technically, but it's right on this. Having received the power to construct the other, right? So there's a receptivity. But there's a receptivity in the sense of the human consciousness, having been created by the omnipotent Creator, is, in traditional language, we would say that traditional language is in the image of the Creator. I would say maybe is the image of the Creator, where the image of the Creator has become itself no longer simply a passive picture, right? But is the image of the Creator is the Creator's gift to the creature of that active, constructive enterprise or activity that we call consciousness or knowledge, right? And then the other aspect of the receptivity, right, so as it were, in the relationship of human consciousness to the omnipotent Creator, that's a receptivity. And if the analogy, what I call in another context the absolute analogy of being, taking Thomas twice as far as he wants to go, in the absolute analogy of being, then that which is constructed by the human consciousness, qua other, is intrinsically related to the consciousness as that which the consciousness receives. It creates or constructs. Its construction and its reception of its object are indistinguishable.
So the receptivity in both cases is now occurring, as it were. It's not
Yeah,
like,
oh, yeah.
It's not like somewhere back there I received this essence of the capacity to create productively. I must be receiving that in every moment.
Correct.
As I am also creating in every moment.
Right.
So there would be a kind of continuous flow
Right.
of receptivity and productivity in both dimensions.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Can you say that one more time, because I missed it? It was just the part about the construction and reception, the simultaneity.
Oh, well, you got the first part. He was asking, where does the receptivity come in? The receptivity comes in on one aspect of it is the receptivity of this consciousness and its freedom, the perfect freedom of consciousness, might be another way. That is its receptivity from the omnipotent act of creation, and because what traditionally would be understood to be being created in the image of that creator, right? Where now image is the constructive activity of creating. Okay, right? It's the creature's participation in the divine omnipotence. It's a participation in omnipotence. Okay. Wait a minute. But the object, I say, is other. No, there's no self-other relationship here. So if the consciousness is creating something that is perfectly other, then that constructive activity of the consciousness, if I try and pull it apart, okay, cannot be distinguished from the receptivity that is implicit in the otherness of the object. In other words, the act of construction and the act of reception are identical. It reminds me of something I said when I was answering Voltraut's question on the meaning of Eucharist, right? That the Eucharist is a thanksgiving. It's a giving of thanks, you could say. And the form of giving thanks is the reception of the body and blood. Okay? So the notion that the reception and the construction are really indistinguishable. I mean, we can make a logical distinction, but the claim, the reality in the thinking now occurring is that the construction is a reception.
So that's where the transformation from the exclusive Eucharist to the inclusive Eucharist that takes place in the end of Novitas Mundi.
Right.
So that makes sense. So I mean, I can understand that the acceptation of the Eucharist is the giving of thanks.
Right. But the giving of thanks, but the giving of thanks is not just saying thanks.
Of course.
If you're going to be grateful for having been created in the image of an omnipotent creator, what is the produce? You see, the thanksgiving to construct is what it means to give thanks.
But no, just let me see, because this is a point where I'm always thinking I've got it.
Okay.
I have an intuition that works extremely well with it.
Okay.
And then if I hold on to that, it turns out that there's a dissonance at some point. My experience of what I would think of as being that productive creativity really does have to do with exactly what you're talking about, this absolute simultaneity of what you would ordinarily call perception and imagination. That there's no gap between my acceptation of what is going on in my mind, in my body, in my surround. If I'm making something, that creativity has to do with an utter fidelity, not in the sense of there's something over there that I've got to be true to, but that I'm absolutely one with it. There's no distinction between the material and the form, as it were. If to use, you can call it all these different things. So the receptivity and the productivity means that I'm in a continuous loop, as it were. With if I logically divided it up to what I'm producing, I produce all this. However, in the next instant, all this is what I'm receiving, so that the production actually can go on. So there's never a point in which the production gets finished and is over there, and now I can walk away with my satisfied self as the producer of this product.
Right. That's right.
Because everything will go on again instantly. There's no gap between what I have produced and the next instant of receptivity, productivity.
Okay. I can live with that explanation, and it occurs to me then to bring in the thing that came up in conversation with Alia in class a couple of times here recently, the notion therefore of the incarnation of the transcendental ego, in the sense that there's no time out, there's no transcendental ego that can in any way be removed from this activity, right? Okay, well, we have to get to the text.
All right.
I think. I mean, it's valid issue. I mean, it's fundamental, but still, I think we need to get to the text and see if we can.
Which text is that?
This text. Now, where to do so is always a problem. So we're going to back up again and try and play catch up here. Let's go back to 459. I just wanted to point out. Well, there are two reasons to go to 459. One is I quote there a little below the middle of the page. Well, let me, since actually this came up as part and parcel of the question and answer we've been going on here. Dropping down maybe to above the middle of page 459, it must be something like 15 or so lines. At the end of the line, the sentence begins, "The originality of the essence of American thought is that it is neither the absolute self-consciousness of Hegel nor the belief in self-consciousness of Kant, but the infinite postponement of self-consciousness in the form of the belief in the reality of the transcendental ideal. This is the infinite postponement of self-consciousness in the form of the belief in the ideal order of the three categories, in the form of the belief in ideal, that is, self-sacrificing identity, in the form of the belief in sociology," and then I quote, to give some meaning to that statement, I quote Peirce, who has this very enigmatic but very telling little phrase in his text, that consciousness is a sort of public spirit among the nerve cells, man as a community of cells. And the reason I just want to note that is that in looking for at least formal anticipations of the thinking now occurring, in the subtitle of this book is what? Matter, the body itself, right? So already you have an American consciousness in a incomplete form, right? But you already have the notion of the organic, bodily unity of mankind as the community of cells. And then I say the inversion and reversal of absolute self-consciousness at once the inversion of the self-consciousness of unconsciousness, which was critical idealism. I'm referring there to Kant. This other consciousness of unconsciousness is the belief in technology. Now I'm referring to American consciousness as the form of the infinite postponement of self-consciousness. I might have said, in the context of what I was saying to Todd, I might have perhaps more clearly written here, or more to the point, or at least added the notion, not only the postponement of infinite self-consciousness, but more precisely the postponement of the realization of an infinite self-consciousness, which would then allow me to bring in what I already brought in, the realization of an absolute self-consciousness infinitely postponed would be the postponement of this infinite postponement of the absolute otherness, or the absolute particularity, which is God fully revealed in Peirce's language. Dropping down to the fifth line from the bottom of 459, the halting inconsequence of this circle is the essence of American thought, a relative window, indeed a generalization of the organs of sense, which is a blind seeing, the monad related to the other ideally. And that's just a kind of succinct way of tying pragmatism in the hands of its founder, Peirce, into obviously Leibniz and the monadology, in which the cells are the monads are windowless, right? Although each of them is in fact is the whole universe from a certain point of view, and also ties in with Heidegger's denial of the necessity of making the distinction that Leibniz makes, because Heidegger, interestingly enough, says in that passage that I quoted earlier in the text, he denies the distinction between the inner and the outer. That is the premise of the blind, to say. But when he does that, and you could say there's a sense in which the thinking now occurring also denies, obviously, the distinction between inner and outer. The form of that denial in the context of the thinking now occurring takes the form characteristically of the notion of an absolute exteriority, right? There's nothing, right? So and the analog of absolute exteriority is absolute otherness, right? So so it raises the question in passing. So what's the difference if I didn't? I don't think I hit it before. What's the difference between Heidegger's denial of the inner and the inner-outer distinction, and the thinking now occurring denial of the inner-outer distinction? And the difference is that Heidegger is into owning, right? He's into a pre-consciousness form of subjectivity, right, or a pre-consciousness form of self, whereas, right. So it makes a difference. I could put it that way. It makes a difference whether one denies the distinction in and out, inside and outside. It makes a difference whether one does so in the context, a continuing context of modernity, which even in the hands of Heidegger is a subjectivity, even if it is, as he says, however he put it, not a one-sided subjectivity, which is all very ironic, given what I'm quoting here. It makes a difference whether one does so in the context of an ultimate commitment to the self before consciousness as Dasein belonging to being, right? There you can see, that's interesting. Now I'm saying that just to go back over just quickly to make the connection there, the difference between the thinking now occurring in Heidegger on that point, right? That sense of belonging is about the perfect antithesis, and the sense of owning that's fundamental to Heidegger's thought is like the perfect antithesis of the kind of absolute otherness and the absolute discontinuity that is being understood to be the crux of the act of an omnipotent creator succeeding, as it were, in omnipotently creating something that it is not. Okay. But back here on page 459, what I want to say positively about pragmatism is that in pragmatism we have a kind of blind seeing or an ideal relationship to the other, as opposed to what I say following on here somewhere, that in the thinking now occurring, the relationship to the other is not an ideal relationship; it's an actual relationship, right? All right. Then we get into the at the conclusion of that, in a verbal sense, the fourthness. There's an attempt here on page 460 and 61, to understand fourthness in some kind of relationship, at least for openers, to the three categories, firstness, secondness, and thirdness, which are the work of Peirce, right? And so I say on page 460, and by the way, you'll see the reference there to Altizer in the previous paragraph. On page 460, in the first paragraph beginning on that page, I say this last mentioned new humanity known to be present is the furthest possible extension of the essence of modern consciousness, Altizer. It is now time then to answer the third and last question. What is the essence of the relationship of American thought and the New World Order? The answer is subsumption. The New World Order categorically subsumes American thought. The categories are ordered categorically. Now, let me just pause there, because that has a lot of resonance, right? To say that the categories are ordered categorically, I mean, says a number of things simultaneously. But one of the things is that it says that the order of the categories is not, as it were, up for grabs. It is not
hypothetical.
It's not adventitious. Is that a word? I think it's a word.
Sure.
And so what fourthness is, as it were, the embodiment of the categorical ordering of the categories, right? It is, in that sense, it is the fourth category, but it is the category, as Alia pointed out last time in passing, is not to be confused logically with a fourth person, or where the one on the left-hand side of the equation is not an additional one to the one or the zero or the unum on the right-hand side of the equation. And so in that sense, fourthness is the categorization of the categories. And that's what, it's that in a certain sense is a kind of the perfect completion of the intelligibility of reality in principle. Do you see? And that perfect completion of the intelligibility of reality in principle is exactly what is missing in pragmatism. All right? And its existence in the form of the thinking now occurring is at the same time the understanding that the identity of consciousness is, as it were, formally speaking, an absolute now. So that the notion, right? In other words, if the reduction of the categories to a categorical order, and I want to just bring in here, just by way of reference, another level of this would be that thing which I handed out to you some meetings back, which is a kind of an elaboration of something point made in the text about the fact that unum is the middle term in the 0 unum 1 sequence, and that it is, as it were in Hegelian language, determinately so, and that even if I were to arbitrarily rearrange the order of the digits in that analysis that I did, nevertheless, the middle term would only be in the middle if it was associated with the unum. So the unum is either itself straightforwardly always the middle term in that order, or if I manipulate the sequence in an intelligible way, right? If I manipulate the sequence, the substitute middle term will only be the substitute middle term because of its unique association in that context with unum, all right? Well, that would be, in terms of the 0, unum, and 1 sequence, that would be an example on a certain level of what I'm talking about, a categorical order of the categories. In other words, that there is an irreducibly, categorical, irreducibly, an essentially definite order to the categories. Is your hand up?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you regard this fourthness
Right.
as somehow analogous? What? Sorry?
I just coughed.
Okay, don't do that. Do you regard this fourthness as somehow analogous to the essence of the third person of the Trinity? That is, the Father, the Son love each other so much that that love becomes a person. So the categories, the ordering of the categories as such, is so substantial that that ordering becomes another category.
Becomes another category. If I heard you right, you were asking me, part of your question asked me, was I associating fourthness with the love between the Father and the Son? Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say no, because the love between the Father and the Son, in the logical terms, would be the unum. It would be which would be the equivalent, the analog, not equivalent, the analog to Peirce's notion of thirdness. So fourthness is more like to go back to the discussion we had about Augustine when this issue first came up, the one about the digits at least first came up when we were doing the appendix, the digits superimposed on Augustine's text. So the fourthness would be, if there's an analog to it, would be like not any one of the three persons, where the third person, the Spirit, and analogically would be the unum, or would be thirdness in Peirce's terms. But fourthness would be, if there's an analogy there, it would be to the essence, the one essence, which what Augustine says, each of the three persons, he wouldn't use the word independently, but in effect that's what he's saying. Each of the three persons is the one essence, and two of the three persons is the one essence, and three of the three persons is the one essence, right? Now, if that gives you problems in math, okay, fine, but theologically that's the message, and in the real trinary logic, it's not a problem. I mean, the real trinary logic may be a problem, but within the logic, that's the way it works. So that
the identity, though,
huh?
the identity
right.
of the one person,
right,
to the Godhead, let's call it that, and the two persons of the Godhead, the three persons.
That's right.
That identity
right.
sounds to me like this fourthness.
Okay, I have no problem. If I'm hearing you right, I have no problem with that. The identity.
In other words,
Right. That's right.
Is that correct?
I think so.
I mean, well,
I have to be very careful with you, but I think that's right.
I'm not here to subvert you.
I
I'm
know.
here to
I know.
help
I'm
you.
teasing.
I'm here to help
Don't
you.
take it too
No,
seriously.
I'm not.
Go on.
I'm just trying to.
Yeah. I think
Other
so.
people, I want to clarify.
I think so.
And
In fact, I refer to it in here, or at least in this section, as an identity factor or a category. Fact of identity. Yes.
Yeah.
So, in a certain way, yes, it is that fact of identity which. I don't want to use this language because this is the way we would have spoken. We have been speaking in the past, right? But as it were, it would be like the common element. The problem with common, that philosophically and strictly speaking, the common element, like the genus, is something that can be distributed, and so the species takes up a part of the genus. Now, Augustine is denying that theologically, and I want to deny that logically. But as it were, that fact of identity as fourthness, like the divine essence, is like, but is not, a common element. Right?
I just have
Okay.
one historical question.
Okay.
Right? If you could think back to when you were writing this,
Right.
was that identity somehow or other what occurred to you and that became the wellspring of writing down this whole thing that's in this paragraph? Can you think back to when you were-
I'm not sure. I didn't get the question
I'm asking
part.
a
What's the question?
historical question?
Right. Which is?
Which is the thinking now occurring
Right.
occurred historically,
Correct.
right?
Right.
So I'm asking you to think back to when you wrote this down.
Okay. And but what do you want me to try and recall?
I just want to know whether what I've described as the identity, the sort of the elevation of the identity of the
Right.
three persons into a fourth category here.
Okay.
I'm just wondering whether that is how this part of the thinking now occurring historically occurred.
Oh. If the question has to do with the Trinity?
The question just has to do with this paragraph.
Just the
You're
no.
jumping along.
Okay.
and
Well,
how-
I'm not thinking about the Trinity here.
Okay.
When I wrote this, if you're asking me the historical
That's what I-
question, I think I've made the point earlier, not today,
Yeah.
that it was only afterwards, so to speak, that I discovered the rather precise analogy to the Augustine's theology of the Trinity. So if the question is, was I thinking in terms of the Trinity with a capital T? No, I was not.
Okay.
Okay, but on page 460, let me just zero in on something. A little below maybe I'll just continue here. So I'll just continue on. So I say the categories are ordered categorically. For the first time, the category of fourthness exists. Let me just interrupt myself because it's related to Jim's question. The fourthness is a fourth category, but the reason it isn't added on in theological terms as another person or whatever, the reason it's analogous to the divine essence in the theological analog in Augustine is that it is the category of categories. It is the category which categorically orders. Right? It's the category of the order of the categories, and in that sense, it's not separable from the order of the categories, but it's not reducible to being, as it were, simply alongside of them as a fourth in that additive sense, right? Okay.
Is it like a syntax?
Yeah, that's not bad. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. For the first time, the category of fourthness.
Are you raising the syntaxes here?
Jeez. You should have to pay the syntax for that.
Well, it's not. I probably will.
If firstness, now this is starting with Peirce again. If firstness is the orience, that's his language, being or freedom, irreducible to self-consciousness. If secondness is pure otherness or existence as force or resistance, again, these are different ways in which Peirce himself describes secondness. And if thirdness is the middle term, relation or essence, then fourthness is that which is originally after secondness, but before thirdness. That is, after the pure other, but before mediation. Not the fact of existence as force, but the fact of existence as actual force. The fact of existence as actuality. And here, one level of what's going on here relates to that idea of the monad in pragmatism as being understood in the context of the thinking now occurring as an ideal relationship to the other, as opposed to the thinking now occurring where the relationship is to the other actually. All right. So by categorizing the categories, what's understood to be going on here, the categorization of the categories, the introduction, as it were, of fourthness as the category, the ordering category, if I can put it that way, or the category of the ordering of the categories, which I think I've already said a few minutes ago, in effect, coming at it from a slightly different angle, is the elimination, you see, it's the reduction of existence to a kind of perfect, its existence as categorically intelligible, right? Existence as perfectly intelligible, or it's the identification of logic and existence, as I would have said earlier and elsewhere in the text. Okay, so not second, but as actual force, the fact of existence as actuality, the fact of identity. And another thing that occurs to me as I'm rereading this now here in class is that, and it goes to something that Chuck was, I think, pointing out about the act of creation not being something in the past. I think you put it somewhat like that it's actually occurring now, and the form of that actual occurrence now is the absolute now, which is the identity of consciousness. And so what I'm saying here, speaking of the historicity of this, is that as I'm speaking, as we're speaking, as I'm writing, as we're reading the text, right, this fourthness is actually existing. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, it's not just, all right, we're already in the appearance of the fourth category. We're already, to use the Adams phrase in a totally different context. It's already begun. We're already on the road. It's not a question of about to begin anymore. Right? We are in the midst of the beginning, or what I was going to say, we're already, in the logical sense, we're already beyond the distinction between logic and existence. Or between the logical and the actual, right? As when fourthness appears, that's already that distinction in the past, right? And in that sense, it's I want to say it's like doubly, right? Or doubly, the double division idea. It's kind of doubly the actuality. All right, and in fact, fourthness, the fact of identity, forces itself between. Yeah, see, now I say forces it. Why would you say that? I mean, what, it's kind of crude. What does it force itself, right? But forces itself, you see, means again this idea. This is an actual occurrence in the history of thought. Do you see? And forces itself. I'm playing on what Peirce would understand by that is that it's existing. Do you see? It has qua existing, it has as all existence and factuality has for Peirce as such now. It has about it the quality of whether you like it or not. Do you see the quality of factuality? All right. So and that's why it forces itself between the fact of existence as force and mediation with an absolute originality. And there, what I'm trying to conjure up, and I think I anticipated this, I don't know if it was this spring or last fall when we were doing foundation, but I remember saying something like, I think it was last fall, I remember talking about fourthness because it came up in some other context as a kind of super, I think I called it a kind of super originality, a super firstness in Peircean language. And now I don't use the word super here. I'm a little more technical. All right, it's an absolute originality, and yeah, okay. Indeed, as absolute originality, as that beginning absolutely irreducible to self-consciousness, as the beginning of a categorically other consciousness, the beginning of the consciousness of the absolute force of identity, the transcendence in essence of the originality of the essence of American thought. What occurs here and now is the fact that logicality, forces itself, at once is logicality forcing itself through and over the radical illogicality of a logicality, the elements of which do not exist, in such a way as to reduce the radical dishiscence. I think I made that word up, but it comes from the Latin. It's a kind of thoroughgoing inconsequence of the circle of merely logical elements to logic, to, in the first instance, the logical order par excellence. And here I take the categories and I put them in the order that I characterize in the section 3.1, the logical order 1, 2, 4, 3. All right. So, in other words, when fourthness forces itself into the three Peircean categories, it forces itself in between secondness and thirdness. Do you see? It comes. I think I explain. Do I explain that why here? The logic of that, or maybe I skipped over it. But it does so basically because it presupposes secondness. It presupposes existence. If it, as it were, is going to come into existence at this time, it's presupposing existence in the Peircean sense, and yet it's conceding to Peirce that it ought not to come after thirdness. Do you see? As precisely in Peirce's terms, when Peirce rejects fourthness, he says we don't need it. Thirdness is sufficient. I can combine anything with thirdness, right? It's unnecessary. We have all that we need, says Peirce, right? Which is another way of Peirce saying backhandedly that he's not about to add a fourth category. Do you see what I'm saying? He's not going to count 1, 2, 3, 4. And I've just said to Jim in a totally different context, and fourthness is not an additional category on a line with firstness, secondness, and thirdness, right? And so the way it's described here is that, yes, Peirce is right. It isn't a fourth category. It's not that he didn't go far enough down the road, so to speak. Do you see? He went down the road as far as he could go, and this is not going down. It's not extending the road. Right? It's not extending modern self-consciousness, even in its American radically modified form. Do you see? It's breaking through it. It's breaking into it with an absolute originality, and in that, in effect, is a reordering. Right? In other words, the categorical ordering that fourthness is at once a reordering of the categories. Do you see? So that the first level of order in the new order is the logical order 1, 2, 4, 3, right? Fourth, right? And then I say, and in the second instance, to the absolute order transcending the logical order, the existential. And notice I'm identifying here, which should not be news, but I notice that I'm being very explicit about it, that the minimum order, the order in which fourthness is placed at the head of the line, so to speak, you see, is the existential order par excellence, right? It's the order in which the logical order is the order of existence, right? And the order of existence is, in this sense, if grounded is the right word, and I'm not sure it's the right word, but just to speak by analogy, the minimum order, the existential order par excellence, if it's grounded in anything, it's grounded in an absolute originality, which then frees us categorically from any and all notions of subjectivity and continuity. You see, as an ultimate framework in which we can understand the intelligibility of our experience.
To what extent is 4, 1, 2, 3 an a priori judgment?
Only to the extent that, and this is not going to make you happy, that in the thinking now occurring, which if I haven't said it already in the text, I will say it before we're through in the text. Only to the extent it is a priori, only to the extent that in the thinking now occurring, the a priori is identically the a posteriori. All right,
Now, why did I know that?
Okay. Well, you mean it was a sucker? It was like you're just lobbing it up there.
Yeah,
okay.
Right out of the park.
Okay.
Except there is a park.
Right. Okay. So, all right. So fourthness, firstness, secondness, and thirdness, or the fact of identity, reflection, appearance, and essence. This last, the order of the transcendental dichotomy, comes up again here, notice, in which the priority of the absolute originality of the immediately existing other is logically perceived. That is, in which the priority of the absolute irreducibility to self-consciousness of the immediately existing other is logically perceived. And this is just another way, really, of trying to work out in this particular framework, this notion of the otherness of that which is otherwise, and that wouldn't be a joke, the otherness of that which is otherwise receptively produced, right? Receptively constructed as other. So fourthness then is the index, I might say, of the absolute irreducibility to self-consciousness of the immediately existing other, right? Not of some idea of the other, not of some name of the other which is distinguished from its existence. I might also have said. All right, and then I speak of. This struck me when I wrote it, and it strikes me in rereading it in the next sentence. If the essence of the New World Order is to create a new world, then it is clear that the transcendence of the merely relative originality of the essence of American thought, right? Now, and by the way, I don't want to downplay the importance of pragmatism, and this comes out in Chapter 7 of Faith and Philosophy very explicitly, when I contrast Peirce's logic, which is very complicated, relatively speaking, compared to Hegel, and also relatively complicated compared to the thinking now occurring. So there's a kind of neatness in the thinking now occurring that is kind of Hegelian-like. Peirce's got a kind of more gummed-up logic, which, however, is very neat, by the way. I mean, it's just more complicated. But what I point out in Chapter 7 of Faith and Philosophy is that if I wanted to compare Peirce, in the simplest terms, to Hegel, it's the priority in Peirce of firstness to secondness. And if I would have put, and in effect that's what I'm doing in Chapter 7 of Faith and Philosophy, if I would have put Hegel in Peircean terms, Peirce's complaint about Hegel, that in his terms, is that secondness comes before firstness in Hegel. You see? That nature is prior to, speaking of priorities, is prior to freedom in Hegel, whereas freedom is prior. That firstness is not going to be displaced in Peirce. So the openness in American pragmatism, compared to the absolute self-enclosedness of the Hegelian synthesis, right, is not accidental. It ultimately reduces to the originality, and I mean that in the categorical sense, the firstness, the quality of firstness, and its priority. Its firstness is first. Peirce gets the credit for that, or American consciousness gets the credit for that. And so what I'm saying is that, yes, except that from the perspective, as it were, of the thinking now occurring, even that originality of American thought is relatively so, right? And the relativity of that, the lack of absoluteness of that originality in American thought is tied. It's just another aspect, or another facet of the continuing, of the infinite postponement of the ultimate absolute particularity, or the ultimate realization, self-realization of the creator, and or it's another facet of the continuing distinction between logic and existence, or in a little more technical terms that we discovered in going back and forth on different occasions in that afterward to the logical chapter where I do some examination of Peirce's triad. It's going beyond that continuing distinction in Peirce between the abstract anything, the abstract letter, the abstract name, the abstract point, and its relationship. Right? We said the problem is that Peirce, even when Peirce does a kind of violent move and names his three elements, day, night, and dawn, he does so acknowledging that from a purely mathematical point of view, the elements that he's dealing with, or from a purely logical point of view, the elements that he's dealing with, if he didn't superimpose upon them these names to make them a little more intelligible, in and of themselves, they bear no relationship to one another intrinsically, right? So what we're saying in the thinking now occurring is that the relationship between the three elements of the logic is intrinsic, all right? It's which is another way of saying it's categorical, I think, in the context of today's assignment. All right.
Is there anything to be any significance to be assigned to the sudden wave of ampersands in these 2 pages?
Well, I don't know.
You just get tired? Or?
No. This question came up when I was dealing with the proofreader for Faith and Philosophy, where it also appears fairly frequently. And the question was raised, well, why is that? Why? And my answer was, which I think is probably true here, although I haven't thought about it here, the ampersand more closely ties
the here and the now.
Yeah, right, or whatever, the X and the Y, but the ampersand is that they go together, right? I could say that there were 10 people in the room, John and Bill was there and Harry and so forth, but that's a relatively loose conjunction. The ampersand is to make it a more meaningful conjunction. That's all it means to me. I don't know that it's critical, but I think it does communicate something if you understand it that way. Where was I going? Okay, so then it is clear that the transcendence of the merely relative originality of the essence of American thought, while and precisely because it is the transcendental founding of the organs of sense, while and precisely because it is the absolute window of the knowledge of what is transcendent. All right, so there, by way of contrast, right? In other words, certainly not a windowless entity, monad, and certainly not a entity or monad which denies, in a Heideggerian way, the distinction between inner and outer in the context of a kind of, I probably can't say absolute in the case of Heidegger, but in a kind of, in his own way, in a kind of thoroughgoing self-orientation, and not even, the point would be, not even the partial openness of the monad or the entity, which is characteristic of pragmatism, partial openness meaning the ideal relationship to the other. In other words, the admission in principle, right, that the other is not simply reducible to the self. Right? That's a big advance. Nevertheless, compared to that, the thinking now occurring is an absolutely, how do I put it, an absolute window, an absolute opening, if you want. And the absolute there has the concrete significance of its being a relationship to the actually existing other on the part of this other, where the otherness is, as it were, the last word in terms of the identity of the related entities, right? So the absolute differentiation of existence, the absolute particularization of existence, the absolute otherness of existence itself would be different ways of trying to formulate that or articulate it. All right. So while and precisely because it is the absolute perception of the new humanity, it is not, nor can it be, a form of time itself before now, a form of expectancy, a form of experiencing the presence of the world. So it's not a future orientation. It lacks the distance that I've tried to point out to you is intrinsic in the notion of presence, of being present. The essence of the new world is absolutely to create the new world. And that goes to the fact that there's no time out, that there's, right, that we're not getting ready to create the new world. The essence of the new world is to create the new world, to create the new humanity. Willy-nilly, we are in the act of doing so. Right? In Adam's language, we've already begun, as it were. To perceive this essence is to perceive absolutely the new humanity in the very form of the beginning. All right, and okay, let's move then into the next section. This quote from William James, Chuck told me, I guess last time, in or out of class, whatever, was very struck by when he first read it. And it is a very striking thing, especially coming from James. Okay, William James is, and we all have some sense of William James. He is like the middle guy in the triumvirate of classical American pragmatism. So with Peirce, then James, then Dewey, in some kind of roughly chronological and certainly ontological order, I would say. And James's place in that little fuzzy Hegelian setup, he's in the place. He's in the right place. He comes second, and he's deeply the second guy. He's definitely the guy who's into particularity, right? The particular individual. He's very uncomfortable with the kind of generalized notion of pragmatism that Peirce has, that a concept is a rule for possible action. It's a rule for action. If certain circumstances arise, you will act accordingly if this is your idea, right? But Peirce is not interested in the sense in which James is. I've got to be careful here. Maybe in more senses than one. He's not as interested, certainly not as interested as James is in the here and now. Okay? So James is a here and now type guy, and pragmatism means, yeah, I agree with you, there's a connection between thought and action. I agree with Peirce. Peirce is a genius for zeroing in on that, all right? But nevertheless, William James, I insist that the real meaning here is the notion that a real idea or a real concept is something that makes an actual difference, emphasizing the word actual here and now. In a particular, here and now, not for the future. Okay? So he's a now, particular oriented type guy, but he's got one particular tick, fundamental philosophical tick, which is crucial, and that is that he has a radical impatience with Kant. I quote him somewhere. I think it's probably still coming up. I don't know whether we got to it yet. But James had the temerity to say, imagine, in all seriousness, he writes down on paper that, the history of thought would be better off if we just make a detour around Kant. He thinks of Kant as the bric-a-brac of the mind or something like that. It's a complete waste of time from James' point of view. Totally unnecessary. If we follow the English lines, Locke and Hume and so forth, we don't need Kant. Right? Now, in taking his detour around Kant, the substance behind that notion is that there is no substance. That's right. Or a little more carefully, that there's no substance that isn't our experience. Right. He quotes. I think I quote him quoting Berkeley in here. Right. So just to back up here to this quotation, it's really interesting then to have James, who has no truck with substance as a serious notion at all, because he's the here and now pragmatic mind. You say, what does substance mean to me? Right? I have to do something. I'm not interested. I haven't got time for substance. Right? Nevertheless, notice he acknowledges that, referring, as he says there in the fifth line on that quotation on 463, certain disputes about the mystery of the Eucharist, substance here would appear to have momentous pragmatic value. Right? So in the whole history of thought, not accepting Aristotle, right? In other words, in the whole history of thought, the only example that he can even entertain where substance might have been meaningful would be in the question of the transubstantiation of the Eucharist. So it's not just me, right? And it's not just Kant. You know what I'm saying? Okay, and so Peirce zeroes in on this, and he says, since the accidents of the wafer don't change in the Lord's Supper, and yet it has become the very body of Christ, it must be that the change is in the substance solely, right? Which, of course, is exactly Thomas Aquinas say, hey, right on, you got it, Willem, you got it, right? And as I say, this is that Thomas's distinctions gives us the formal setup for the Kantian move. The bread substance must have been withdrawn, and the divine substance substituted miraculously without altering the immediate sensible properties. But though these don't alter, a tremendous difference has been made, no less a one than this, that we who take the sacrament now feed upon the very substance of divinity. Okay? The substance notion breaks into life then with tremendous effect if once you allow that substances can separate from their accidents and exchange these latter. This is the only pragmatic application of the substance idea with which I am acquainted, and it is obvious that it will only be treated seriously by those who already believe in the real presence on independent grounds. Okay, so there's no access from philosophy for James to this, but if you were to believe for totally other reasons than your philosophical enterprise in the transubstantiation, then you would be dealing with something which in principle was a powerful notion, and a pragmatic notion made a difference, right? Because ultimately, it's kind of boiling it down, but I made the point certainly in the text of Novitas Mundi, that sacred doctrine, as elaborated by Thomas Aquinas, anticipates on one level, it anticipates what I subsequently identify as the moral purpose of modern science. Descartes, yes, he wants to found science anew on a perfectly firm foundation, which is analogous to the firm foundation of theology, by the way, not incidentally so. Just saying. Yes, Descartes wants a science of the natural world that will be useful to mankind and improve the human condition, to say. But what is that to say? That is to say something that Aristotle wouldn't know what he was, where'd you get such a crazy notion as that? I mean, let alone doubting the experience of your body. In other words, Aristotle there was no grounds metaphysically for Aristotle to call into question his experience of the world, do you see? Because his experience of the world was not making a claim to actually being known. It was making a claim to being potentially known, but he didn't have an intellect that had an independent existence of what was actually known. In other words, his human reason, Aristotle's human reason, was a possible intellect. It was capable of knowing all things. But as grounding of science, and Kant, by the way, also, I think I quote this in Novitas Mundi, Kant also, when he compares science with the moral life, or when he compares what he calls the theoretical or speculative intellect with the practical intellect, Kant is very explicit on this. There's no right? He and Descartes they're in sync on this. They're in sync on a lot of things called modernity. Right? And what Kant says is, well, we can't have, even though we talk about his dualism, right? In principle, Kant says, well, we can't have a simple coordination of the speculative or scientific intellect and the practical intellect, because if that were the case, the scientific intellect has delimited its area and it would exclude from its domain all moral issues and so forth. And on the other hand, we can't simply have it included in the practical intellect, right? Because the practical intellect would not, it would intrude, right? It would make claims that don't have any value. All right. So having said that, he says, nevertheless, we must understand that the scientific intellect is subordinated to the practical intellect, right? Or science, knowledge is subordinated to human freedom, right? Or to human freedom, or to the autonomy of reason. Morally speaking, all right, is that in terms of which, if I'm going to prioritize them, it gets the priority, and science is, in that sense, if I speak in theological terms that Thomas Aquinas would understand, science, science is the handmaid, do you see, of the moral life of mankind. That's what Kant is saying. Whereas Thomas would say, philosophy or science is the handmaid of theology. See? Theology is the queen of the sciences, the human sciences. He doesn't have the science, no science problem. Thomas doesn't, right? There's a knowledge of God based on revealed principles, and then there's a knowledge of everything else, right? And theology is the queen of the sciences, to which is subordinated, as defective and imperfect, the human sciences. You see? And so now in that analogy, which I've just kind of discovered in passing, right, that for Kant, science is the human knowledge, you see, can't make quite the distinction of theology and philosophy exactly, right? But you see where I'm going. Analogous to philosophy is human science, and the autonomy of human reason in that analogy, backwards from Kant to Thomas, is what? In the place of theology, in the place of the divine revelation. So what happens in modernity is that the Aristotelian essence makes a comeback, as Hegel makes clear in spades, you see. But now the Aristotelian essence makes a comeback as the essentially divine nature of human consciousness, do you see? Which is now not a particularized divinity, one among many in a polytheistic universe, but is now a universal divine principle, thanks to the appropriation naturalization, rationalization of what Thomas Aquinas would have understood the omnipotent creator to be, and which he did understand the omnipotent creator to be, what Thomas calls a universal agent. See? But notice Thomas calls the creator a universal agent, not a universal thinker, not a universal reason. In other words, Thomas puts the emphasis on the act, right? Because for Thomas, God is ipsum esse, or actus purus, pure act of being. And in that sense, God, unlike the modern God, this is why there's a kind of straw man going on in the death of God theology, right? Because the God who is dying in Altaiza is the God qua idea. Do you see? God qua representation. But the God of Thomas Aquinas, the God who is the universal agent who has omnipotently created the world, is a doer, is activity, I don't know how you could overstate it. It is the sheer activity of being. Being itself is pure act, right? In which pure act, thanks to the creation, we as creatures, or the world as creature, participates. That would be Thomas' way of putting it. Okay, so back to so I quote this because, of course, it's quite relevant. That is James's concession, his what I would call his formal concession, right? The other thing I like about it is James, not being a Thomist, not being a Catholic, and not therefore not adhering too closely to the subtle distinctions that any good scholastic would make. He says something which is very neat in the historical context. He talks about the body and blood of Jesus, which would be the Orthodox traditional understanding of the new substance there, right, in transubstantiation. He talks about it in a kind of unequivocal way as the substance of divinity. To say, so it's at least a formal preparation for the subtitle of this work, right? What we're dealing with here is matter, the body itself, where we are understanding in the context of Novitas Mundi and Foundation that the body we're talking about is the body, which is the universal form of the incarnate Word. You see, so the Eucharistic, right? The Eucharist of existence itself is one of the ways in which I phrase it. So what I'm getting at is that already in pragmatism, here in a very special and especially interesting way, in James, already, and you see it in a more less vivid way in Peirce, perhaps. Already the distinction. Okay, a little defense here. Already the distinction between appearance and substance, right, which is radical in Kant and overly simplified identity in Hegel from the American perspective. Already that distinction is blurred. When being and nothing merge, when I can't draw a fine line in Peirce between where the appearance ends and the substance begins, all right? Already when substance and appearance are already blended together. They're already in some sense unified. Not in any perfect sense, and not, by the way, just to ward off the suspicion that the thinking now occurring is some sort of Hegelian idealism, not in the way in which substance and appearance are identified in Hegel. They're identified in Hegel where the appearance is the sublated moment, right? Where the appearance has no truth of its own other than its being the appearance of substance. Do you see? As such, as appearance, it has no more truth than the hamburger after I eat it. Do you see? It is there to be consumed. It is there to be seen through. Do you see? To be the temporal spatial form of the substance. So Hegel needs to be understood over against the backdrop of Kant, and it's a very precise thing he's saying. Kant is saying, go back to an earlier level of the discussion, the noumena is not what appears. Appearance is appearance. We construct the appearance. And in the appearance, I don't have any noumenon. I don't have any substance there. Am I saying there's no substance? No. God forbid that I would say there's no substance. I got too long a tradition going back to Aristotle to say there's no substance, right? And I don't want to fall into some sort of simple solipsism, perhaps, yeah? But nevertheless, in the appearance, I don't have a revelation of substance. I don't know. But Hegel is saying, yes, I do. Do you see? He's saying Yeah, they're identical, but the identity is of a very special kind. It's an ideal identity. That is, it's an identity in which the appearance is an ideal reality for Hegel, which means for Hegel, a reality is there, now I'm speaking ontologically, momentarily, right? It's the reality of appearance is to serve as the middle term in the process by which, right, the eternally divine substance comes to know that there really isn't anything other than itself, even though at first blush it looked like maybe these appearances had some kind of status, you see? But these appearances could only have a status, you see, in this context, if they were the work of an omnipotent creator, right, and who did not, by virtue of its omnipotence, did not need to distinguish them from substance in order to give them, as it were in Hegelian terms, a truth of their own. So that brings us to where the thinking. But nevertheless, there is, because of those interesting things that happen in pragmatism, there is a kind of preparation for this. And then in the early pages of this, let's zero in here a little bit on page 466. Yeah, at the top of 466, I say the genius of Kant was to reduce pure practical idealism to the form of appropriation, to invert Hume. But the genius of Hegel was the absolute reversal of critical transcendental idealism in the form of the appropriation of the very absence of the substance of divinity, in the form in turn of the very transcendence of the original synthetic unity of apperception. Now this is a little tough. But the reason I'm putting it in these terms is because I'm trying to implicitly, if not explicitly, incorporate the critique of Derrida and Altizer here, right? And what I'm really saying in effect, although I'm not taking any time out to say it, what I'm saying in effect is, well, I think I must say it in Novitas Mundi, although I don't do Derrida and Altizer, but it's just that, and even and pragmatism. These are extensions and or critiques of Hegel that follow Hegel, right? Without, which is not so bad, I mean, but without altogether breaking with Hegel. So that thing I referred to, that I'm reading Kierkegaard at home, I read this whole thing about the independence of omnipotence, if it's really going to create the independence of the creation and so on, and I say, boy, this sounds very familiar. I think I could have written this. Maybe I stole it from him, I'm thinking. See? And then I look carefully, no, because this is a continual letting go. Right? It's not a once and for all event in Kierkegaard. Right? So what I'm saying is that whether it's Kierkegaard or Derrida or Altizer and so on, there is not altogether a break, right, with the subjectivity, which is absolutely presented. You said he retired and played cards afterwards. He did such a good job. Absolutely presented by Hegel. I mean, Hegel knew that no one was going to outdo him in that particular project, right? People came along and they tried to get around him, under him, right, etc., punch him in the face and so forth. But nevertheless, they were in one form or another in reaction to Hegel, you see. And the reactionary part, what I'm saying by which I mean reactionary, is that they were still connected, right? There was still not an absolute break with Hegel.
He thought he had guaranteed that connection.
Well, I realize that. Okay. Okay, so what I'm saying here is, implicitly, I guess I'm saying it, but I want to bring it out of the text. I want to unpack it, as they say. That when Hegel did his number on Kant, it wasn't simplistic. In other words, this issue we started the class with turns out to be very relevant, right? In other words, what was missing, right, was the noumenon. Right? Not that it wasn't simply said not to be, but in effect it was said to be absent. Do you see, from the ken of human knowledge?
You can't.
Yeah. But so when I say Hegel denies the dualism, but it's not a simple-minded denial. In other words, he starts with the absent noumena. You know what I'm saying? He starts with in his own language. You have to find the passages in which he does this, right? But what he starts with is what he would call the immediacy. He starts with the appearance. He starts with what is present, do you see? And then insists upon going through the very profound intellectual syllogistic motions where basically what happens is that I think I brought this passage in months and months ago, where the middle term goes through its own. The middle term is the going through essence, going through its own nothingness. Remember that? Okay. So the point is, he doesn't simply deny the absence of the noumena. Do you see? He wants to see in the presence of the appearance. He wants to see that absence in there. That's the dialectical element in Hegel. I can't really do justice to it, but I'm just kind of pointing at it, right? And that's an important thing to realize. Because it helps explain the Hegelian aspect of Altizer. Do you see? And it also, which however is not totally unrelated to his being a kind of negative. A kind of perfect negative of the pragmatic move, because that in turn we describe as a kind of fuzzy Hegelianism, right? So in other words, the play here of presence and absence, and the question of are the noumena present in consciousness? So I'll put it in Altizerian terms. I'll put Hegel in Altizerian terms. What Hegel is saying is yes. The absent noumena are present. They are what is present. What's present is the appearances, right? And the absence is the form of the absence. The presence of the present is really the presence of the absence. The appearance is really the appearance of the noumenal, right? The time and space are really the time and space, the truth of which is substantial. Not in themselves, right? But they are the manifestation of the divine substance. That's what he's saying. Okay, and that's his broad generalization of the incarnation, and this is exactly what Kierkegaard wants to call him on, right? That he's made it all too. Now it sounds strange to us. For us, it's easy now, right? We've been through all this stuff, but I mean it's kind of abstract. But Kierkegaard understands, abstract or not abstract, difficult or not, to the average person to read Hegel. Hegel's made it all too simple. That's what Kierkegaard is saying. He's made it all too intelligible. He's made it all. He's eliminated the paradox altogether. Okay. All right. So that's the major point I wanted to make on that page. Let me see here. Yeah. Okay. I won't try and say it over again. Then I have a long quotation from Hegel, which is also interesting, and if you put that together with the James quotation, right? Because Hegel has a whole diatribe here in the philosophy of history on the question of the Eucharist, and the basic point of that, the basic Hegelian point is that in Catholicism, that is in pre-modern Christianity, right? In the world of Thomas Aquinas, this thing called transubstantiation means that once the bread and wine are consecrated, now the substance is the bread, the substance is the body and blood of Jesus. And now I have here, under the appearances of bread and wine, I have, in James's language, the substance of divinity, and I'm going to have to treat it very carefully. Right? The point being, not just that I have to treat it carefully, but I do have to treat it carefully. Why? Because it's, if I use modern language, it's objectively there. It's not, as Luther, Hegel quotes with approval, it's not the Protestant notion that, yes, there is a change of sorts of the substance of bread and wine, but it's only there, the technical term is in uso, in use. In other words, there is, more technically for Luther, it's a consubstantiation. So Luther's already, boy, talk about dualism. Right? In other words, when I go to communion in a Lutheran church, I'm already a dualist, because I'm getting the substance, the divine substance in James' term, but I'm still getting some bread substance and wine substance, right? So there's a consubstantiation, is what Luther says, right? So you notice already the retreat from what is a radical idea. Transubstantiation is a radical idea, right? There's a kind of retreat from that, right? And a kind of compromise. But the other part of the compromise that Hegel zeroes in on is that the divine substance part of that communion is only there for faith. It's not there scientifically. It's not there, I want to say, in Thomistic terms I can say that. It's not there in a way that science would have to take it seriously. You follow what I mean? In other words, Thomas doesn't claim that he knows scientifically, he can understand exactly how it is that this should be a new substance, right? He doesn't claim that. That's a miracle. But given the belief that the transubstantiation takes place, then science wants to deal with it. So it wants to explain. Well, it wants to explain how it is that the appearance is coherent. And I pointed out the coherent quantity. Okay. But what I'm getting at is that it's at least a scientific problem for Thomas. But it's not going to be a scientific problem in the modern context, transubstantiation, because it's already declared to be, you see, it's not there objectively, it's there for the believer. In other words, it's not being denied that there is a presence of the divine substance. It's just not there, how shall I put it, in terms that would have anything to do with science. Wouldn't trouble science to have to figure out what to do with the appearances afterwards, you see? I'll put it in other words. What Luther does then is he introduces in the theological realm, in anticipation, he's on the cusp of modernity, he introduces subjectivity, right? In other words, the consubstantiation, the reality of it, is tied, it's dependent upon the subjective disposition.
The object is there subjectively.
Yeah, okay, something, yeah, okay.
But I mean, James's point is precisely that the noumenon is there and it changes without there being any appearance.
If you believe it, says James.
But that's
for those who believe it.
Well, it's that yes, that's the pragmatic side,
right?
That from the point of view of if he's going to maintain the pragmatic argument that it has to have some practical consequence. So for the believer, it has a practical consequence. Right. But still, the thing that he is describing is the description of a change in the noumenon.
Oh yes, yeah. Okay, all right. All right. There are a number of things we could do here. I think probably to move to the place where Altizer is doing his reading of James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, and that's on page 471 and following. And Altizer says, what's this, is History of the Apocalypse?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. He says, I actually say that. Okay. Altizer says on 471 in the quotation, for the death of God is the self-sacrifice of God, and not only, and by the way, I think I passed over it, but there's a place in here where I quote Peirce making reference to the popular notion that one can go to hell for the salvation of his fellow man, right? So in other words, he kind of naturalizes and abstracts and takes with a kind of seriousness the notion of the descent into hell. Peirce. Yeah. As an example, in other words, that all he wants to prove by that, minimally, is that it's not at all an outlandish or inconceivable notion that one would be motivated by self-sacrifice. And that self-sacrifice, and of course, Altizer has taken that to the nth degree, right? See, that God himself in Altizer has sacrificed himself. But in doing so, you see, God has been, in effect, reduced to the man Jesus. Right? From a naturalistic point of view, Jesus died, you see, and that's where Altizer is going to leave him, and Thomas Jefferson left him there in the grave, you see. Altizer adds, in a very Peircean-like way, the notion that he went to hell for the sake of the world in Altizer, or that Jesus is a man who we understand, people in general understand in this Christian world. He doesn't point it so, but he knows that, and he says it elsewhere. Right? So what I'm getting at is the notion that the self is not the ultimate center in American consciousness, American pragmatism, is not only scientifically important, but it also has moral implications, right? It also has moral and political implications. The refusal or the inability, fundamentally the refusal to reduce the other to a function of the self, and indeed to imagine, right, a kind of selflessness, you see, as perhaps, if anything, is at the center, at least ideally so, right? he makes the distinction. Peirce makes the distinction very, very.
Those ideas that we actually believe in this idealism, even though we can't perform it.
Yeah, that's what he says. So he lets you off the hook there. Kierkegaard wouldn't let you off the hook. That is, even somebody who can't himself, is not capable of self-sacrifice, at least understands this as an ideal.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the reason I thought of that was that here we have Altizer now taking this idea of the death of God in this context, in effect, you see, and he's reading into, or he's, I don't want to say reading, I think he's reading into, but he's certainly understanding Joyce in the context of the death of God theology. And he says, for the death of God is the self-sacrifice of God, and not only... See, the very phrase self-sacrifice implies not only Peirce, American pragmatism, but it implies behind that the centrality of self-consciousness in modern consciousness. For the death of God is the self-sacrifice of God, and not only is the executed the executioner, but the condemned one is the eternal judge, and nothing whatsoever distinguishes guilt and condemnation, or crime and execution, because victim and judge, and host and creator are one. And then dropping down a few lines, he says, true, these primal motifs are dismembered and disguised in Christian mythology and theology. So notice, this is one of the interesting lines of critique of Altizer's death of God theology. The last thing he can stand is the primordial Godhead. You see, that's what puts itself to death. That's what sacrifices itself on behalf of the world. And yet he has no problem taking Christianity back and reading it in terms of a primordial notion of sacrifice. Right?
I know that's just very, very strange. I mean, these recent books.
Yeah.
I mean, that pick up on this and go further with that.
Yeah. That's right. I would say it's not strange because ultimately, if I want, in other words, I think I do this actually in the last chapter of this book. At least I make a stab at it. I do it essentially, if not completely. I will effectively try and point out that what doesn't happen there, in other words, the absolute future in Altizer, again, it's the same idea, is not perfectly disconnected from the absolute past. In other words, the refusal of the past, almost like the perfect refusal of the past, is the necessary prerequisite for his absolute future. Right? To be absolutely empty, to all that has been, to have come to this blank, to this, at best, sheer possibility. You see, in the meantime, sheer emptiness of what all that we have hitherto known as interiority. You see, that to me is the failure. I mean, that's the continuing evacuation of the now in favor of an absolute future. You see, which is just the other side, as it were, of the ontological coin of a, I don't think he uses the term, but maybe he does somewhere, of an absolute past. You see, of a past which in some sense is in no way a resource for us. So in the thinking now occurring, we keep pointing out in response to something you said some meetings back, that there's a kind of bringing forward, a kind of salvation a kind of redemption of the truth of the past. That's the best. That's a technically correct way of putting it. Okay.
I would think, this is sort of half what was behind my question about receptivity. Continuing that is that there's a certain receptivity to the past in that sense.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
That as new possibility.
Okay. All right. All right. But Altizer, continuing with what he says there. True, these primal motifs are dismembered and disguised in Christian mythology and theology, but they are present with an immediate power in the Eucharist or Mass, which is surely a decisive source of the power and authority of the Mass. But that authority and power can only be recovered and renewed by reversing and inverting the given or manifest form and language of both liturgy and catechism, of both scripture and creed, and inversion and reversal which is present in the wake. All right, and then before I get into what I do with that, look over on page 472. pursuing the line of thought, he says, the nullification, Altizer does in the bottom quote, of God embodied in the resurrection of Book 4 of the Wake is a realization, or, you know what I love about Altizer? He's great. He's just great. This is not an accident. He's a very careful writer. So when he says realization or self-realization, right, to say, it's the ambiguity is,
he has a unique or.
Well, yeah,
It's
but
not an alternative.
it's not a private matter. This is the form of the pragmatic refusal to make an absolute statement other than, says James. This is great. James is not stupid. See, James got books about, we're not going. He's anti-Hegel because Hegel's an absolutist. Now, watch this. And we're pragmatists. And I'm James. I'm the here and now, down to earth, particularized pragmatist, right? And don't talk to me about the absolute and all this jazz. I mean, idealism and right. This is James. He has no patience for it whatsoever. But he's not stupid. He says, by the way, I think I told you in a different context, that Hegel, if he hadn't been an absolutist, was one of the most brilliant analysis of our experience. He says this. James says, right? But he screwed it up. He monumentally screwed it up, is what James thinks about Hegel, because he wanted to take the undeniable fact that every affirmative sentence can be followed by a not. I did that joke, right? That's a beautiful hairdo you have. Not, right? He takes that truth, right, of the negativity that is always the possibility of our positive experience, and he wants to absolutize the negative. Hegel does. That's his mistake. Okay, now why did I get off on that? So, James
as being an absolutist.
Oh yeah. Okay. So there's no question where he stands. But now he said, can James say, strictly speaking now, can he say that the absolutists are absolutely wrong? And James can't say that. So where's he left? Okay. Well, being a pragmatist is not a problem, because if what I think is the case, that they're completely wrong, but I can't say, strictly speaking, that I absolutely know that, right? I can justify rejecting them because I have a more practical, pragmatic understanding, you see? That's one way of doing it. But where is he actually left, strictly speaking? He's left, and if it was Altizer, if James, well, I do James and Altizer later on, so we're going to see how Altizer is James. But if James were Altizer, if he could transpose himself forward, he would have said, well, he can't absolutely know, right, that there's no absolute, but he can certainly, absolutely, if he were Altizer now, will it. You see, in other words, where you're left for James, much more easygoing. James is very easygoing, very down-to-earth guy. He prefers to think that absolute reason is. It's a preference. It's a nice way of saying that's what I want. That's the way I want to think. That's the way I will think, right? Because it suits me to do so. Right? But true, I can't absolutely exclude the possibility that I'm wrong. Right? So one way I phrase it later on in the text, one way of getting the spirit of pragmatism, it's the absolute maybe. And Altizer, what's triggered all of that? So when Altizer says that the death of God, the nullification of God, is a realization or a self-realization of God, right? Wherein the whole perfection of being realizes itself in the pure actuality of ipsum esse, or existence itself. Now I cannot, speaking of historicity, I cannot avoid pointing out that, in fact, in this book, which I don't actually quote it because I don't want to lend any credence to it, he wants to compare the thinking now occurring, Altizer does, in this text, from which I'm quoting parts. He wants to compare it in some affirmative sense to what his understanding of Joyce is, right? And so in his text, he's using ipsum esse, and so very self-declaredly under the influence of the thinking now occurring and its use of Thomas and so forth and so on. So he's led to do these kinds of things. He's trying to see in the Catholic Joyce, right, something like the Catholic Leahy.
Didn't he write a letter to that effect?
Well, he might. I don't
I
remember.
think he did, yeah. You wrote a letter to one of your...
Oh, to somebody else, you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he wrote the letter in connection with the Loyola appointment or something like that.
It's
That
possible.
rings a bell.
It's possible.
Okay.
In any event, I don't buy it as accurate, and therefore I don't. But I'm not. I don't want to deal with it. What I am calling your attention to is that when he speaks here of pure actuality, ipsum esse, and so forth, he's very, very self-consciously trying to relate Joyce to the, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly, to the Thomistic tradition, and to that extent, to something that's going on in the thinking now occurring. But that actuality is here realized, here meaning in Joyce, not simply through language and speech, but in and as word and speech. For now God is fully and finally logos, or word. That word is pure immediacy, an immediacy which is darkness and light, and pure darkness and pure light, a light which is the cosmic and apocalyptic sacrifice of God. Now, whatever is to be said about Joyce here, this is certainly Altizer, okay? And in that context, what's noteworthy, among other things, is the notion of a sheer immediacy. What if it could be defined and conceived logically, which it cannot, doesn't exist as a logical analysis at all in Altizer, but that sheer immediacy in his language is an identity of darkness and light. All right, so the absolute darkness in Altizer, I think we've said this before, is not an alternative to light, but it is, as it were, as he says, that darkness is that in and as which the light appears. Right? And that, again, is a kind of taking to the nth degree what I was talking about in pragmatism as the blending, the dawn. So, see, Peirce has got the night, the darkness, and the light, and he's got them merged, at least as far as the middle term dawn goes, right? Now, imagine, I don't know how you would actually imagine this, but logically you can kind of think it through, I guess. Imagine the dawn being the perfect indistinguishability of the light and the darkness. And then you have, I think, in some sense, what Altizer is driving at, right? So he's taken that, right? He's taken, and so he calls it reaching again back in the European tradition to Nicholas Cusanus as the coincidence of opposites, all right? In which, however, both of these opposites, how shall I say, in their identity, have, as it were, I want to say, a status of their own. All right. So just as in more general theological terms, the primordial Godhead, which negates itself, which sacrifices itself, which empties itself out into its own otherness, which in Altizer's language is not simply a doubling of identity, but a self-doubling of identity, a doubling of the self into the other. Right? Now I can't, in that self emptied out into its otherness, right, or that light emptied out into its own darkness, would be the analogy that's working here, right? And so somehow or other, in that darkness, I must understand that I'm dealing with the light, but I'm dealing with the light which has now emptied itself out into its own otherness.
But the otherness is taken with the full seriousness of the identification of Jesus and Satan.
Yeah. Okay.
And, I mean that is his vision.
Yep.
And,
okay.
I always think when I'm going through this that it's a Joycean line, but it's not from the Wake. It's in Ulysses, where he has Daedalus is saying, the darkness shineth in light, and the light comprehendeth it not.
Okay, which is turning
which
John inside out, right? Yeah.
But it's sort of the superimposition of those two ideas that the light, the darkness, the light doesn't comprehend the darkness which is the creation.
I'm glad you said that. In today's reading, I make the point. I don't know if I could just pick it out that quickly. That would be nice. Just hold the place we're at. 489. This is a very subtle thing, but I'm glad you brought it up. It's not so subtle in the expression you just gave of it. I mean, the expression from Joyce. But on 490, I'm making what I consider a subtle distinction, which I think is in accord with what you've just said, and dropping down a little above the middle of page 490, right after the last numbers there, a little above the middle. Not that absolute liquidity is the form of absolute repetition, absolute end of days, absolute rational, but that these are forms of absolute liquidity, not the absolute liquidity of identity, the identity of absolute liquidity, but the absolute repetition of identity, the identity of absolute repetition. And then I refer back to something we did discuss at some length. The discernment of the darkness is absolutely the shining of the light. Not that the absolute Jesus of Nazareth is the known identity of the darkness, but that the darkness is the known identity of absolute Jesus of Nazareth. All right? So so that reversal that you've just referred to, I'm in effect saying that reversal of the John passage, that the light shines in the darkness, the reversal, the Joycean reversal, that the darkness shines in the light, and the light doesn't comprehend it. I'm saying that in some sense that is appropriated, or that coincides with Altize's reversal, and the thinking now occurring is, as it were, here what I'm trying to get at is the restoration of the I want to say of the original order, but you see, there's no such thing as a restoration of an original order that isn't.
But look at you just read this 3 times and see if we can get what you say, because you do say it, I think. That not that the absolute Jesus of Nazareth is the known identity of the darkness.
Okay, so
which that would be the Joycean,
that's right,
Altizean position. That's
right.
But that the darkness is the known identity of absolute Jesus of Nazareth. Right. I think that is it's a subtle. It trumps the truth of the insight of the first position.
Right. Okay.
That there is the truth of that insight is then here's the darkness, and it is that darkness in which the light shines, rather than here is this. Here's this apparent lightness, which is really the darkness.
Yeah, it's tough. Let me try it a slightly different way. In other words, I think...
Before you...
Yeah.
Pat and I have supplemented our Metropolitan Opera stuff with the Ring Cycle.
Ah.
And so we listened for 2.5 hours before going to Das Rheingold on Saturday to a guy explaining the history of Wagner's, I think, 28-year effort to produce this thing. And I must say that the number of people who have seen The Ring and who continue to clamor to see it exceeds those who are trying to puzzle out Finnegan's Wake by some astronomical exponent, right?
Yeah.
Not to mention those who are rallying to go to see the Fellowship of the Ring.
Right.
And both of these things, especially Das Rheingold in the beginning, deal with this whole subject symbolically, perhaps, and certainly musically. This whole question of, out of chaos, how is light and darkness sorted, right? And in some sense, that's what this massive shining object, this Rheingold, at the depths, the abyss of the Rhine, that's somehow how it evolves. And it would be nice to see somebody try to apply this logic to that, as opposed to this arcane stuff that I can't believe that Finnegan's Wake will survive. Well, certainly won't survive Wagner, but
okay.
And
Well,
it hasn't.
I don't want to get into that debate.
But I mean, that's all Tyser's.
Well,
Anything that's arcane.
Because it's easier for a book to survive than for opera tradition, which might not survive.
But anyhow, the
Okay.
this arcane, Now, what can I write about? Well, see, I'll write about something that nobody cares about.
Well, okay.
Let me try.
I think you're confusing. I think you're privileging popularity here. I think.
Well, I would think that creation, if you want to really get serious about creation, you should attend to popularity.
I think his way's pretty funny. Get into it a little bit.
All right. Anyway, we just can't. We're not competent to deal with this. So back to the text on 472. Altice's text. That word is pure immediacy, and immediacy which is darkness and light, and pure darkness and pure light, a light which is the cosmic and apocalyptic sacrifice of God. If the epic action of the wake proceeds out of the dark abyss of primordial sacrifice, a primordial sacrifice which is creation, that sacrifice culminates in the transcendental repetition of. So now he's borrowing this is very deliberate borrowing of the language of Novitas Mundi. Culminates in the transcendental repetition of creation itself, a transcendental repetition which is the apocalyptic repetition of God said. Now what he's doing is he's taking the language of Novitas Mundi, which is from the get-go beyond the notion of self-consciousness, you see, and he's reading it into Joyce's description of what I call the black mass, okay, and interpreting it, Altizer is interpreting Joyce and in effect the thinking now occurring in terms of self-sacrifice, do you see, which is, I would say it's obviously an illegitimate move. I mean, it may create an interesting text and it may advance his argument concerning the nature of what Joyce is doing, all right, but it's a misapplication of the language, at least contextually. But an apocalyptic repetition reverses primordial repetition, right? So what he's done there, you see, what he's done is he's taken the transcendental repetition of existence itself in Novitas Mundi. He's assimilated it to a notion of apocalypse, which in his self-conscious context, an apocalyptic repetition, which is a reversal of a primordial repetition, right? Whereas I think you can read Novitas Mundi and Foundation from now until Doomsday and find no such reversal of a primordial situation associated with anything that the thinking now occurring would understand by apocalypse. All right. So this is very much Altizer on Joyce. And in Altizer's reading, an apocalyptic repetition reverses primordial, so that let there be light becomes let there be darkness, which is analogous to what it's an analogy in the context of the first word of creation, as I refer to it in here. The first thing that God says is let there be light. Okay, so let there be darkness, an apocalyptic darkness reversing but nevertheless renewing the primordial abyss and night. For the night language, or the not language of the wake, embodies the brute and formless matter of the primordial water. But now that water speaks, and it speaks with an immediacy that has never been sounded before, or, there we go again, all right? Or, it's either never been sounded before, or not sounded since the original act of creation. Now what I do a number of things with this. I was fascinated with this text of Altizer's for a number of reasons. So I took, in the context of looking at it in the context of what I was doing, composing Foundation, all right, it was a natural thing to go back again to the Hebrew in this case on page 473, and to take what Altizer says about the indistinguishability of guilt, condemnation, crime, and execution, which is all, that's his English. I've supplied the Hebrew. I've done the mathematics on the Hebrew, and I've also put his indistinguishable foursome into something he would never occur to him to put it into the form of a proportion. In other words, I've made his foursome, how shall I put it, literally rational, and in doing so, and proving that proportion, that proven unity is just the proof form of that, where you would be looking for a 1, you get 39.062. which I say where on page 474, where the proof form of that proportion is the inversion of the identity of the meal offering, identically the inversion of the integral product of the proportion of the double abyss of I am, which inversion is nevertheless at once the identity of God, compassionate and gracious. So if you were to follow back there, which I don't think we'll do now, I don't think we need to do it, but to go back through footnotes 23 and 24, we did spend some time, by the way, on those sections in class where in those places in the text, I have previously, as I say, put in a proportionate form the death of God theology as enunciated by Altizer. And here he does it again in a different context. And when I apply the same methodology to it, I find that there is a deep consistency, ironic consistency in his thinking, because his thinking is the inversion of the way in which the intelligibility of his otherwise unintelligible death of God was previously set forth in the text. All right? So his notion is, how shall I say, I think you could say it's self-doubly unintelligible to him, right? In other words, he doesn't see the first level of intelligibility, and he certainly doesn't see that level of intelligibility as what, in effect, is in a hidden and dark way, I mean, in a way perhaps that does not appear, that's strictly noumenal in the Kantian sense, ironically, that non-appearing intelligibility of his own text, he not only doesn't see it in the first instance, but in the second instance, as he were, not seeing it. If he were to see it, what he would not be seeing is that the intelligibility of his text is, in some sense, straightforwardly the inversion, do you see, of what is now intelligibly the case. And again, run together here through the mathematical linguistics with the notion of the compassionate and gracious God, which, as far as it goes, is part and parcel of his intention qua death of God theologian, or his intention is that the death of God is to be understood as the ultimate truth for Altizer of the divine compassion. You see, of the suffering of God, which is the traditional understanding in the person of the Word made flesh, is now taken through to its ultimate in the death of God. God has been so gracious and so compassionate. This would be Altizer's understanding. So compassionate that the lightness has turned into the darkness. Right? That his presence has turned into his absence. Right? And that is in the positivity and the negativity of Altizer's death of God theology, is that is the act of a loving God to destroy himself as the way, as the means, as that self-negation in and through which self-damnation, in terms of his more recent text, the self-damnation of God is so it's Peirce's. It's Peirce again. Well, Peirce says, well, we have in a popular religion which will remain nameless on this page. We have the notion that a man can sacrifice himself for his fellow man. And of course, this man, when we have the notion, we understand traditionally, all those popular guys who have this notion understand this man to be God. Do you see? And so now in Altizer we have a kind of unvarnished and absolute version of the man God, or the God who is man, or the God, in Hegelian terms, the humanity which is substantially divine, do you see, putting an end to itself in an act of graciousness and compassion for man, for what I want to say, what in effect are his fellow men, right? Right, you see, the clinker. I was almost going to say then I thought clinker. I was almost going to say for others. You see, or for the other, you might even say. Right? Now I make the very stiff and hard and unfriendly point in one of the appendices to Novitas Mundi, that the thinking now occurring is not a matter of being for others, nor, for that matter, against them. It's not a matter of being for or against. Right? And Hope picked up on this in our correspondence. He got that point. And so instead of saying that in theological language, God dies for others, right? Which I think Altizer might be assimilated to. God's death is being at the disposal of another. That's the precise language of Novitas Mundi. And that means to connote, not necessarily denote. Maybe it does denote it. It's certainly the creative act or the sacrifice associated with the creative act, in Altizer certainly, and then historically, sooner or later, is a being at the disposal of another, is to connote something of that distance, something of that radical freedom that is the relationship between the creature and the creator. You see, even in the act of what otherwise comes to be in the modern period understood as an act of self-sacrifice, right? It's not self-sacrifice, to say, and to the extent to which it is a sacrifice, it is not so much a sacrifice for others, but it's the embodiment of the notion of being at the disposal of the other, in the sense of the liberation of the other to exist. To exist. The language is tough here because of history. To have the status of a fully actual existence, independent. Again, a word I'm not crazy about.
So is this then basically to repair? In Altizer's view,
right,
to repair a defect in creation? In other words, is he saying that originally the world was not created independent enough? The omnipotent God did not exercise all of his omnipotence, or he didn't have it, and it came to him later. And the ultimate creation of this truly other.
It's a creation. It's a defect in God. That the primordial God has this quality of pure cyclicity and repetitiveness, which he breaks out of into creation.
By killing himself.
Well, first into creation, and then the completion of that is yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it would be, I think, did you say defect in God? Is that what you started with?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something like a defect in God. I'm a little troubled by the way you're phrasing the question, because I want to be sure that you understand that when I talk about the perfect independence of the Creator and the creation, I'm not talking about Altizer. I'm talking about...
No, I understand.
Yeah, okay. Now, in Altizer's case, I would say... It depends on how you read it. In other words, the primordial God is the bad God because he's indifferent to the creation. And so I'm tempted to say, I mean, I have to think this through, and I don't know whether I want to lock it down, but in response to your question, I've been tempted to say that implicitly, if not explicitly, in Altizer, the problem with the God who sacrifices himself ultimately in what would then for Altizer be the true understanding of the act of creation is a God who in destroying himself, destroys his remoteness from the creation, right? He, in effect, empties himself out into the form of this creation. And therefore, in a certain way, I would say the sensibility, certainly in the context of thinking now occurring, is that independence has the independence of creature and creator, to the extent to which there is one in Altizer, is a negative. Whereas in the thinking now occurring, it's a positive. It's a gift. It goes back to the notion of the passivity of reason that I bring up of modern reason, I bring up in Novitas Mundi. All right. In other words, the notion of the continuing other self relationship. Right. That's intolerable, I think, to modern consciousness, and I think the necessity of the freedom of Altizer's God to eliminate himself the necessity of that is ultimately the passivity of reason, although it's much submerged in Altizer, who has gone beyond, even the modified reason of out and out reason of pragmatism, right? But in other words, so it's reason in the abyss. It's the
it's every form of disconnection and detachment, whether it's scientific or the failure of people to respond to a evil political situation. I think that's hugely in his mind about those things. So his idea is that the primordial explanation for the enormous evils of modernity is given by this detachment of the primordial God.
All right. Okay. So then, likewise, with he has another quartet there on 474, 475. I do the same kind of methodological move there with his identification of victim, judge, host, and creator. I guess what I'm doing there, I say I rationalize it, I put it in proportion form. Another way of getting at it is that it's easy to say these are all one thing. Like it's too easy, because then, of course, I'm back. Now, I have to be careful here. To the extent to which there's a mystical element in Hegel, in modern self-consciousness, to the extent to which Bemme and Meister Eckhart and so forth are anticipators of modern self-consciousness in one way or another, to that extent there is that same analogous kind of mystical unity in the negative, right? You see, and it's so from the point of view of a notion of existence as perfectly intelligible, then when I say I'm rationalizing here, I mean this quite deliberately, right? I'm introducing the distinction of ratio and proportion. I'm introducing the structure of intelligibility into what is too easily run together in a I guess you could say, fairly speaking, in a perfect liquidity, in a perfectly amorphous water. I mean, he brings it in. You see that not the word speaks, right? But the water speaks, and the water is the primordial water of a chaos. You see. Okay, so in doing that, on page 475, it turns out that when one rationalizes. I mean, what's really fascinating about it is, there are so many things that happen, especially in today's reading, which we're not going to get to tonight, but we'll get to it. When I do the Platonic line, and I take the Greek terms for the things that I'm labeling, and some of them come from Plato, the new stuff I have to bring in the Greek myself, and I do the rational products, and the rational products happen to coincide with the areas of the diagrams that they're labeling. Right? Forget probability. It fits. It works. Okay. Analogously here, Altizer, he wrote this text. I didn't write this text. I didn't put him up to it. Okay? And yet, when I rationalize his text, when I understand his text in a way which he cannot understand, intrinsically cannot understand it, what do I come up with? I come up with a proof product of this particular proportion, which is the inversion of absolute writing, the inversion of absolute consciousness, the inversion of the absolute text of Scripture read, which inversion is nevertheless the inversion of the created 100 identified with to create, the identification of the elements of this proportion, victim, host, judge, creator, is 2.25, the inversion of the rational product of the absolute proportion of absolute thought. Now, from having lived through it, suffered through it, the absolute proportion or absolute thought, whatever else it is, it's something that Leahy just pulled out, strand by strand, out of the top of his head in the context of elaborating the logic. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, it comes, as it were, completely independent logical analysis leads to this particular proportion. And when I take Altizer's deep theology, if I can put it that way, the theology of the depth, the abysmal theology of Altizer in a very strict sense, I take his terms, translate them back into the Hebrew understood mathematically in terms of the thinking now occurring, it proves out to be the inversion of the absolute proportion of absolute thought. Perfect fit. Fit. That's all I'm interested in. The fit. It fits. It's right. It's correct, in other words.
You're in trouble.
I know.
If it fits, you must convict.
All right. Not denominating unity. The inversion of the created 100 identify with the absolute everybody, everything. That's from Joyce via Altizer. Absolute oblivion. All right. Identify with, right? In other words, so it's the inversion of the created 100 identified with absolute everybody, absolute oblivion, and absolute vanity. Here I'm using that in the biblical sense. Emptiness. You see? The vanity of Altizer's bottom line. You see? Now, one can't escape, certainly in English, and maybe in Hebrew, I don't know. one can't escape the moral implication of the term vanity, as well as the literal, right, to say. And where would be the vanity if Althuser's death of God theology is the furthest possible extension of modern consciousness, which I say here and elsewhere? In what sense is there a moral imputation of vanity? Do you see? In other words, because it is the extreme in an inverted and abysmal form, it's the extreme of modern self-reliance. Do you see? It's the extreme of what I someplace call in Hegel, I guess in the case of Hegel, but this would be the updated through pragmatism version of it in Althuser, of the absolute self-recollection of reason, the absolute recollection of reason upon itself, resting on itself.
How much is there a structure, the same structure of self-consciousness, in the classical structure of vanity? I mean, isn't it, to a certain extent, what you're saying is that there's been, for 500 years or 400 years, or however long it's been, this peculiar kind of projection of a single vice onto the shape of thought.
Right, yeah. Oh, right. It's not unprecedented, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
But what was, in fact, one of the bunches of different possible vices suddenly placed itself over the intensity of thought when sacred doctrine held it to put itself in abeyance.
Right. Yeah, and the analog to that, I would say, is, I would assume, I think I've said it, but I think it should be clear that what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that Descartes invented the notion of self. He invented the self-centeredness of scientific consciousness.
Yeah.
So he put the self in the center,
Yeah.
but the self was there, and the self was already there in Thomas, not in the modern sense, but there's more self in Thomas's understanding of the divine mind than there is anything like that. It's not there in Augustine. To say. Now, Augustine may be when we look at Augustine, and certainly when Althuser looks at Augustine, he sees Augustine as the beginning of self-consciousness. Okay, that has to be taken with a grain of salt, because Augustine, as I point out somewhere in that little paper, I think I put on there. Is that the one? Somewhere, yeah. The person is absolute particular. Maybe that's not it. Anyway, I have somewhere pointed out with some detail and I think I've said in class, there's no noun substantive word that Augustine has no word for self. He doesn't think of self. Self is a purely reflexive notion, but there's no substance to the notion of self in 400 AD. But there is one certainly in the modern period, and there is one coming into being gradually in response to the Incarnation, even in Thomas Aquinas. The way I put it, pedestrian-wise, is that what saved Thomas from self-consciousness in the modern sense was his subordination, speaking of Kant and whoever I just said earlier today, Thomas's subordination of knowledge, human knowledge, to faith. So since it's the same principle. Right? Theology is the queen of the sciences. Thomas subordinates human science to the divine science. Analogously, he subordinates knowledge, in the human sense, understood, to faith. And because he does that, the growing self-consciousness, is kept in check.
Well, there's also the relation of pride to the rest of the sins.
Yeah, okay. I didn't want to go... it's a valid point. I didn't want to go too far on that one. Okay. I just wanted to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, we pushed the clock. I'm sorry about that. We're going to have to play a little more catch-up, but we'll just do it. And
You're not going to be here next week.